You arrived on the 15th, all of you, right? So you were witness of what happened, and above all, what did not happen in Cuba on the 15th of November and the 16th, 17th. Some believe that the country was militarized, that we had the armed forces on the street, that there have been massive arrests, that people have disappeared, and that is the situation in Cuba. Unfortunately, the mass media helped for that impression to exist, and digital networks also allow many people to disseminate this idea, to disseminate misinformation. And that's why I was saying that you have been privileged to see with your own eyes, which is the reality in Cuba. And you must have seen, above all, those of you that come for the first time, that we are a humble country. We're not a rich nation. We're a country that, as most developing countries, comes from underdevelopment. That we are a country with few wealthy natural resources. We don't have mines, or big mines like gold or platinum. We don't have oil. Our topsoil is very thin. Therefore, even though we can have agricultural production, we are not a country that can boast of having a great agricultural potential, even though we should be doing much more than we do today to feed our people and to produce our own food. We don't have what you would call indigenous capacity to create capital, to form capital needed for investment, for development. We are barred from accessing any of the major international financial institutions. We receive preferential long-term credit from no country around the world. Therefore, most of what we can produce depends on our own effort, under the huge limitation imposed by the US economic blockade that I guess you have heard about, or you have been talked about, or you have read about somewhere. So that's the nation which you find. We are a peaceful country. You must have seen that you don't have police with assault weapons around the street, as could be common in some cities or neighborhoods in the United States, in many of the major cities of Latin America, and in many parts of the world. We are a safe country. You can walk out in the middle of the night without the fear of being assaulted. We are a safe country in terms of health. It's more difficult to catch a disease in Cuba than you can have in most countries around the world. And if you do, you have free and access to quality health care that can take care of you. And that's what the people of Cuba enjoy. By saying so, I'm not saying that we do not have problems. We have major problems that come, among others, from underdevelopment. We have a huge debt, for example, in our housing programs. And our ambition, when we speak of housing, is to have quality households for people with access to fresh water, sewage system, to be close to a school, close to hospitals. And we have been much more successful in ensuring the social network that you need for households than in building the house as itself. And therefore, that's a major demand of our population. We have, for the past 2 or 3 years, we've had a huge scarcity of goods. And that has happened at the same time in which we have been introducing economic transformations that we need to make our economy more productive, to make our economy more efficient. And the combination of doing so under the conditions of COVID, of the pandemic, and under the conditions of increased US economic coercive measures has made life difficult today, much more than it was in the past. Now, the US bet, once the pandemic came in, under the previous government, the Trump administration, that the pandemic was going to be an ally in the effort of putting greater pressure on Cuba. That because of the impact of the pandemic everywhere in the world, including highly developed countries in Europe, including the US. In the case of Cuba, another developed country with little resources, with increased punishment from the US, it was going to be much more difficult for us to cope with the pandemic. And that's why, since the beginning, what the US government did was increase and strengthen the economic coercive measures that are part of the economic blockade. And the current government of the United States got on that train too. And even though they were speaking of revising, even though in their political platform to get elected they were criticizing Trump in his policy because of its policy towards Cuba, and even though they were saying they were going to take immediate steps to change that, what in practical terms they did was to continue to talk about revising policy, but in practical terms what they were doing was to continuing to apply and even strengthen what the Trump policy had been for Cuba. And they bet on making this, provoking Cuba a critical situation that would be impossible to handle by the government, by making life difficult for the common Cuban, by depressing the standard of living, by making people become desperate, that this would provoke a level of insatisfaction that would lead to mass demonstrations, if possible, insurrection. Now, this was not invented now. One can look at history and find official documents of the Department of State of the US government from 1960, 61, that describe the aim of the policy. That the policy was to create sufficient levels of insatisfaction in Cuba, in the population, by depressing their standard of living, that this would provoke resentment towards the government and therefore lead to demonstrations and, if possible, an insurrection and overthrow of the government. It was a design plan, a plan already designed from the early 60s by the US government. So what is being applied, what has been applied now, is not something new. Yet, the pandemic showed such an opportunity that the government again bet on doing that in Cuba. Now, we cannot deny that we have problems in Cuba. We do. And we cannot deny that we have made mistakes sometimes in our economic policy. Every country does that. In the US, just to put a few examples, when the economic crisis of 2008, the Democratic government of the time decided as its policy to bail out the banks. But it decided at the same time, it chose not to bail out the people that were losing their homes, that were losing their jobs, that the cities that were being diminished in population, people had nowhere to go, which increased social problems in society. The Trump administration, which came later, decided as its major achievement in government to decrease the amount of taxes that should be paid by the wealthiest people in the United States and the wealthy corporations, increasing the debt of the country and diminishing the amount of money that could be used for social programs. Now, that is, it seems to be, the current government is trying to correct that, having a huge amount of obstacles. Now, most people around the world would agree that all those were mistaken policies. Now, is it fair for any country, or any group of countries, or the international community to decide to punish the American people because of those policies? To say, because the government is doing this, we're going to put economic coercive measures against the people of the United States, make them pay the price of what their government is doing, diminish their standard of living, and make life even more miserable or more difficult, so that the government would decide to change policy. Most Americans don't ask that question. Yet it is what is being done by the US government against Cuba. And not now. It's what's being done for the past 60 years against the people of Cuba. Now they try to justify this with different pretexts of different types. One is that Cuba is a failed state. And the President of the United States, the current President, said so in July. That they were going to take strong measures against our government and our people because we have a failed state. And it's remarkable for the US to say so. Because one can make comparisons of a small country, underdeveloped, with little resources, and the most powerful nation in the world. The wealthiest nation that has ever existed in the world. And then one can make comparisons on what a failed state is. One can look at the inner cities of the major urban areas of the United States. One can look at areas in the state of Mississippi. One can look at areas in the Midwest of the United States, where social services are depressed. When the pandemic of drugs, oxycodone, is growing around, and the government seems to surrender, there's no solution for that. As they have no solution for organized crime, and organized crime behind drug abuse. And the one that's not considered crime, but is the equivalent, the organized crime by Big Pharma, inducing people to take them. Now the government seems crippled. It's being castrated and can't fight that. As they can't fight the central government, the effort to deny people the right to vote in some areas of the United States. And therefore you find that in each election, the United States, instead of going forward, is going backwards. You have more people, more laws, more regulations that deprive people the right to vote. You had in Atlanta this past week in the airport a shooting because a person had a gun with him, and in some way he happened not to use it well, and there was a shooting with people hurt. Because by law, the state of Georgia has said that you can carry a gun anywhere, including an airport that is very close to a school. Yet the government feels that you can't do anything against that. And I'm not saying that it's wrong for Americans, which have a huge territory and a tradition of hunting and using guns, for them to have their own right and their own legislation, which are different to Cuba, different to France, or to the United Kingdom, or to Germany, or to Mexico. But increasingly, it's growing in which it becomes a danger for the population because the gun industry and the weapons industry has a much greater capacity than the government. And the government declares itself castrated. You can't do anything against it. Now they call Cuba a failed state. In our country, and you must have witnessed this in the days you've been here, in spite of our limitations, you find people that have access to health care services. We have been able to vaccinate the whole of the Cuban population with our own vaccine, developed by our own scientists. We learned long ago that in the absence of significant natural resources, we needed to develop our own human resources. And today, Cuba's economy and Cuba's welfare depends above all on the human resources that our society, with the Cuban Revolution, has been capable of developing. And we think that it's not enough. We want more. We believe that we have to make a commitment to continue to develop our human resources, to continue to make Cuba a society that depends on the effort of its population, not on what's given by nature or what's given by another country, but what we can develop by our own people based on the development of our own human resources and our human development. Another of the pretexts that is being alleged to punish Cuba is that Cuba is a bad influence in this hemisphere. That we allegedly are responsible because of instability in Colombia, where there are massive assassinations. There have been massive killings, over 80 massive killings in Colombia. I suspect this is recorded, but I hope this doesn't go in the news, what I'm saying now. In the current government of Colombia, over 80 massive killings. This is a country that's an ally of the United States and that is praised by the government of the United States. The previous government and this one. We are supposed to be responsible because of the street demonstrations in Chile. We are supposed to be responsible because of instability in Ecuador, where 2 weeks ago there was a mass killings in a jail and they killed over 60 inmates in Ecuador. Another ally of the United States. These are the few countries that the Secretary of State of the United States has visited in this hemisphere. So we're supposed to be a bad influence. We know that we have some influence. We are an example of a country that is stubborn in saying that we have a right to self-determination and to determine what goes on in our country. Yeah. And we do not apologize for that. We cannot shy away from that. Yeah. We are an example that a country, a poor country, and of course, certainly a wealthy country, can guarantee health services for all, for free, and of quality. And again, we're not going to apologize for that. We know that we're an example of a country whose national budget, the greatest chunk of it, goes to education, in greater terms than any country in the hemisphere. And again, we know that's a bad example. We know that it is a bad example that we refuse to allow transnational corporation or transnational capital to be the owners of this country. Now, we threw them away 60 years ago, and today we allow foreign capital. We are ready to engage with transnational corporations for the development of Cuba, for the well-being of our people, but in terms that ensure the rights of the Cuban population. And that is a bad example. We're not in debt with transnational capital, and that is, in our hemisphere, a unwanted example. And if that is the pretext, then it's true, but not in the way it is presented, and not in the way it is being related to the people in the United States. Another pretext is that the Cuban government is in conflict with its society, with our youth, with our artists, with our intellectuals, with our religious organizations, with women, with Cubans of an African origin, which is a very difficult equation because all of us, one way or another, are descendants of Africans. In some cases, it is more evident. In some cases, it is more subtle. But the great majority of Cubans have some percentage of African blood, is what we are. But beyond that, which is more important, the African influence is in our brain, is in our sentiment, in what we eat, in how we dress, in how we walk, in how we talk. And I say this now, for me that was a strange idea, but I served 4 years as ambassador in South Africa. And there I learned about this, because the racial issue is so sensitive in South Africa. There was South Africans who had studied in Cuba who educated me this. You don't notice it, but for us it was remarkable that regardless of how you look on your outside, in Cuba you are the same, an integrated society. In South Africa, everything depends on the color of your skin or your origin. But that is another element that is being introduced in the narrative against Cuba. And one last one, of many, but the major one, is that the economic blockade is not the true problem of Cuba. That truly, Cuba's economic limitations are basically a result of Cuba's mismanagement or the fact that we have a socialist system in our country. And this is said, of course, without any evidence whatsoever. One can simply ask the question, what would be the fate of the economy of any state of the United States, let's say California, if the rest of the states, if the state of Texas were to cut its economic ties with the state of California? Or what would be the fate of the state of Florida if the rest of the states of the United States were to cut and to punish and to sanction the state of Florida as the United States sanctions Cuba? What would be the fate of the economy of Canada if the United States were to say we're going to cut 15% of our economic ties? Canada. Canada is a developed country, fully industrialized, high standard of living. What would be the impact for Mexico, which is a huge country, a huge economy compared to Cuba? What would be the impact for Spain if the United States were to say we're going to cut our economic ties? Once those economies start to have problems, can you blame it because there were mistaken economic policies in those countries? Yet this is repeated time after time, and it's being induced through digital networks, even in the Cuban population, by sophisticated and well-financed machineries in the United States. But those of you that have visited Cuba in the past, if you had visited Cuba between 2012 and 2018, you could ask yourself, was there or was there not an improvement in the Cuban economy? Was there or was there not an improvement in the standard of living of the Cuban population? You could see it in the streets. And that was with the very, very limited exceptions that the Obama government introduced to the economic blockade. Now, since 2017, with the introduction of new economic coercive measures by the Trump government, plus the addition of COVID and the strengthening of the blockade during COVID, there is, of course, and naturally, a depression in the Cuban economy. Life today is not better than it was 5 years ago. But you can ask that question to anyone who visited Cuba then. You can ask it to members of Congress in the United States. You can ask it to members of the government of the United States. Was there or was there not an improvement in the economy of Cuba once the US government decided to introduce just limited exceptions to the economic blockade? And was there or was there not a step back once the US reintroduced new economic coercive measures in Cuba? Those questions can defeat easily the notion that the economic blockade truly has no impact on the Cuban economy. And then there's a question, if it has no impact, then why apply it? Why have you needed for 60 years the effort to try to make Cuba unsuccessful? Now today, we can tell you that in spite of our limitations, and in spite of the continued economic blockade, the Cuban economy is viable. It can continue to succeed with many more difficulties than if the economic blockade was not there. With many more difficulties if there's no easing whatsoever, if there are no exceptions whatsoever in the economic blockade, because it's very overwhelming. And it has impact not only in the relationship between Cuba and the United States, it has an impact in our relationship with the rest of the world. There's a persecution of Cuban financial transactions anywhere in the world. The amount of banks from any country, regardless of the relationship of that country's government with Cuba, are limited. Most are fearful, If they have business in the United States, they don't want to do business with Cuba. They fear the real threat of the US government. And therefore, it is very difficult for us today to ensure financing to do trade. It is very difficult to find ships to carry goods to Cuba. It is very difficult to find companies that are ready to run the risk of being punished by the US if they do business with Cuba. That's our reality today. And that increases the cost of us doing business anywhere around the world. It delays shipments. And therefore, it delays the goods or the materials that we need for our industry. It delays the services that we need to provide for our population. And there's an impact in everyday life. From buying the basic drugs that you need for health, for the elderly, for chronic diseases, to the equipment that you and the material that you might need in a hospital to ensure surgery, to ensure basic services, to electricity, to the supply of water, to transportation, and to the basic goods that Cubans need for everyday life, including food. It has an impact on everything. But again, we believe that overcoming the COVID is a major step for us, because it will ensure us to have the legitimate income that we need from tourism, from other services, from people traveling to Cuba. And that in spite of all the burdens that we have and all the hurdles being put by the US, we believe that our economy is viable in a humble way. We're not a wealthy country. We're not a European country. But that basic needs in a dignified manner for the people of Cuba can be ensured. Now, why does the US get away with doing all this against Cuba? And worst of all, of doing it on behalf of Americans, doing it on your behalf, doing it on behalf of people of Cuban origin that live in the United States. And some might agree with them, but not all of them. Yet, on behalf of all of them, you are doing this. To some extent, it is linked to the characteristics and the limitations of the US political system, in which a group of politicians, members of Congress, can get away with monopolizing an issue, which is the case of Cuba, tying it to the electoral importance of one state, the state of Florida, and therefore hijacking a policy on their behalf, and providing a service to big transnational capital in the US that thinks that Cuba certainly is a bad example. And they are not only the promoters of this policy, but they are instruments of this policy for greater powers in the US. They are capable of reaching out to members of Congress, and the government, the administration is part of this. They brief members of Congress. They have meetings, the State Department. They tell them Cuba is a failed state, and they explain why. They say Cuba is a bad influence and a dangerous influence in our hemisphere. It is an advanced position of the interests of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Cuba is like a military base of all those interests in the Caribbean that poses a major threat to the United States. That the people in Cuba are suffering because of the mistaken policies of the government. That there's a caste in Cuba formed by the people of the government, us, that are very rich and very wealthy, and we keep our people subjugated because of that. And many members of Congress, in the absence of an alternative narrative, believe so. When our embassy meets them, they say, well, the people that have come to me to talk about Cuba tell me that you're a failed state, that you're carrying out a very bad influence in Latin America, that you have Russian troops and Chinese intelligence officers and Iranian terrorists in Cuba that are a threat to the United States. Members of Congress that are supposed to be well educated and informed tell us that. And many tell us that honestly and naively, because it's what they're being told, again, in the absence of an alternative narrative. That is why for us, what you're doing is so important. Coming to Cuba, visiting Cuba, going around Cuba to the extent which is possible, talking to people in the street, learning by yourselves, and hopefully that you go back to your communities and you share what you have seen, not what you're being told, but what you have seen. Better off if what you share with the communities is shared with whoever represents you in Congress, or alleges that represents you in Congress, or people who are vocal in the United States, so that the narrative that is being portrayed about Cuba cannot be easily induced into the minds of the Americans, and people can learn from themselves. Our wish would be to have thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans coming to see Cuba by themselves, talking to us, criticizing us, finding our flaws, sharing an alternative paradigm so that we can listen. How does it happen in the US? How do you solve your problems? What have you seen in other parts of the world that you think would be useful in Cuba? Sharing your spiritual beliefs that you believe that we should take into account. That is what we welcome. And our hope would be that gatherings like this one, or different trips or groups like this, can continue to come and increase in the amount of coming. If each one of you is capable of sharing and telling your friend, your neighbor, your colleague, your comrade, your religious partner, whoever, I went to Cuba, you should go. Try it. You'll learn something. It will be an interesting experience. That would be a great contribution to what I think we commonly believe. Because the people of the United States and the people of Cuba should have the opportunity to share openly, to share our values, to share our disagreements and alternative approaches to life, to learn from each other, and to engage without the imposition of the US government, which is in the middle. It's an obstacle for the relationship between the people of the United States and the people of Cuba. So that we can share more in arts, in culture, in scientific research, in education, in training, in sharing skills, in religious cooperation and engagement. That's the kind of link that our two nations should have. Cuba, a small, humble nation, the United States, a big partner, but we can share. The history of our two countries is of learning from each other. There's mutual influence in spite of the political animosity of over 200 years. And we hope, again, that initiatives like this one can grow in the United States, and that it can become not the exception, but the norm of Americans traveling over, sharing with us, and us sharing with Americans of different walks of life that can engage with us and teach us. I would like to, perhaps we can have a Q&A if you have questions. But before that, I would like to convey our profound appreciation for what many of you do. Many cities in the United States have approved resolutions asking the government for engagement with Cuba. And even though it is largely ignored, it is a huge contribution. It teaches people. We'd like to also express our immense appreciation for your effort in bringing goods to Cuba. Not so much because of its material impact, which is important, but because of the gesture. The gesture of solidarity that our people needs to see. We don't want the people of Cuba to identify the United States as an enemy. It shouldn't be that way. Because the majority of Americans don't regard themselves as enemies of Cuba. We know that. And gestures like yours help for that to happen. And help Americans to see that there's an alternative. That there's no right for the government to deprive Americans from the right to travel to Cuba. It is a crime in the United States to be a tourist in Cuba. For you to come, you have to find subterfuge. This is one. You come in a caravan because there's an exchange allowed by a license, but you need permission. As you need permission of the government to send Cuban medicines to Cuba. As you need permission from the US government to send water to Cuba, or to send oxygen to Cuba. It is prohibited by law. You need a license from the Commerce and the Treasury Departments to provide oxygen to Cuba, to provide water, bottled water to Cuba. You need a license because it's prohibited by law. So again, our immense appreciation for your effort, for what you do, for Pastors for Peace, for that I think is a given. And perhaps we can engage in questions. I'm joined by people from our office here that if I don't have the answer, they could help with whatever we're talking.
We thank Fernández de Cossío for his excellent presentation, and the floor is open for you to ask any questions.
There's a microphone.
Thank you for your presentation, and we're all committed to pushing for an end to the blockade in the United States. However, I wanted to ask, in the absence of a full lifting of the blockade, are there specific measures that, for example, that were relaxed in the Obama administration and reimposed? Are there specific measures that would be especially helpful if perhaps we were able to achieve a partial lifting of the blockade or a relaxation? I was curious if you have an opinion on specific areas that would have a lot of impact here in Cuba.
What? Yeah.
Would you rather have a few questions from this?
So what we're going to do is just get a series of questions, and then Director de Cossío can take some and make some answers. David?
I would have, having a copy more or less of what you presented would be a wonderful thing. I'm wondering, and I was just so impressed by everything I heard. So is that possible? I know it's not written, but something that might capture so much of it would be deeply
That's what happens when you speak from the heart.
Yep.
We're very fortunate to have this wonderful array of folk here to serve as resources. Gloria de LaRiva, and I think Cheryl Lamage and others have been recording. So we'll make sure to make that available, because you're absolutely right.
I'm Joe from North Carolina. So when we lift the blockade, because I do believe it's going to happen, I'm just curious as to what your thoughts, especially with your perspective, is of how Cuba might respond to that. As far as, is there any thought? I know your culture, and I'm seeing it, and I see how the CDRs operate, and I see how just how amazing that sense of collective thought and ideology and everything is. But are there concerns that when you lift the blockade, that capitalism and some of the negative effects of it might come in and kind of taint the way of life that you have?
I'm Marty Schmidt from Seattle, Washington, and a member of the National Lawyers Guild. And I would like to ask you about the importance of our work on with other groups in other countries to address the illegal unilateral coercive measures that the U.S. imposes, and particularly how important, from your perspective, is it that we bring a lot more attention to the violations of international law and the impact, as have been so well demonstrated repeatedly in the UN General Assembly by the UN Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures and so forth.
My name is Kim. I'm with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. And you spoke about Mississippi and the southern region in particular in the U.S. the state is used as a tool to really oppress the poor and working class, and the prisons and policing, and I also do prison work. And so my question is, under a socialist program in a worker state, what is the function of the state? Like, how did you make that transition, and what is the state's role and purpose in carrying out the revolutionary process?
Mike Beilstein from Oregon. I'm wondering about the rise of the economic and financial power of China in the world, and if that can provide any relief to Cuba as far as international finance, as China becomes more and more important as a financial power in the world. It's like for things like financing trade, is it possible that you could go to a different source besides banks that are linked to the United States?
Mark Ginsberg from Santa Cruz, California, and part of the Bay Area Saving Lives Committee. I'm interested in the issue of Guantanamo, and wondering if during the short period of time when bilateral relations after Raul and Obama opened up dialogue, whether the issue of Guantanamo was part of any conversations, and whether there's any, well, obviously no progress, but was there some real conversation about that? Thank you.
Bob Miller, a member of the New Jersey Cuba City Coalition. My question is in relationship to Cuba's attitude toward legal immigration, and if you could flesh out the tendency of the United States to ignore legal accords for immigration while promoting illegal immigration into the United States.
The question is, what can we expect and what can we hope as measures from the US? It's difficult to start. But the Biden administration committed to the American people, not the Biden administration, the Biden electoral campaign committed to the American people to swiftly reverse the actions taken by the Trump administration, which were wrong. And when in, I think it was January 12th of this year, the US government included Cuba in the State Department list of countries that sponsor terrorism, the Biden president-elect said that this was a mistake. So, if there was to be coherence in his statements and his promises, not to Cuba, his promises to the people that voted for him, he would at least exclude Cuba from the list of countries that sponsor terrorism. And this is something which is very significant, because it's not only that it's a slander against Cuba. The problem is that once you're in this list, by US law, the government of the United States punishes any organization anywhere in the world that engages with the Cuban government. So any bank, any business, any government agency, anywhere in the world that engages in economic activity with Cuba is punished by the US because we're in this law. Of course, this is a very unilateral law. List. It's illegitimate. It has no recognition or genuine support whatsoever by the UN or any international organization. It just has the power of the US and the might, the financial and commercial might of the United States. So if the government were to be coherent with its own statement, it could take that step and it would be significant. Now this government also, during the electoral campaign, in addition to saying that it would swiftly undo what Trump had done, it specifically pointed to 3 areas. It said that depriving Cubans from remittances from their families in the United States was a nasty thing to do. And you don't do that to people, to deprive their standard of living. Yet, it's been in office for 9 or 10 months already, and has taken no step. All it did was, after 6 months, committed to a commission that came back with proposals, and they refused to accept them. And the US government prohibits the institutional sending, and the cheapest way from anyone in the United States to send money to their relatives in Cuba, thus punishing the people of Cuba. And it's not by chance, it's not something naive, because it has an impact on the standard of living of a portion of the Cuban population. And that there's an aim behind it. It wants to create resentment, irritation in the population, and to turn them against the government. Another measure could be, based on what the government of the United States promised, is to reinstate travel between the two countries. Airlines, cruise ships between the two countries. It has not taken that step. It also said that it would reinstate migratory services of their embassy here in Cuba, which have been suspended since November or October 2017. Meaning that a Cuban that wants to travel to visit the United States, to visit their relatives, or to migrate to the United States, has to travel to a third country with the corresponding expenses, apply for a visa, without being sure if they're going to get the visa, and then come back to Cuba, or from that country migrate to the United States, which is a burden, an economic burden on the Cuban population, again to irritate and to punish the people of Cuba. Those are three areas that the government committed to do, and it has not taken one step. It could erase an illegitimate list of restricted entities in Cuba that they allege are linked to the armed forces or to the security service, or have links to Venezuela, or whatever. And for that, they just have a group of entities with which no American or anyone under the jurisdiction of the United States can engage. They cannot stay in that hotel, they cannot do reservations, they cannot go to a restaurant, including private entities are in that list. But I could go on. The Trump administration applied 243 coercive measures against Cuba. So the list is immense. I'm just putting a few examples forward. Joel from North Carolina. Of course we are concerned. Of course it is something that we take into account. We know the immense cultural, political, and ideological influence of the United States. But that is a challenge that we need to be prepared to take. The Cuban Revolution cannot sustain itself by putting our people in a glass, glass dome. It has to be legitimate, it has to be viable, it has to be successful, engaging with the rest of the world. Believing on the power of our own influence, of what we can achieve and we might be able to achieve. So, your question is a very pertinent question and has been a question in our mind for the past 40, 50 years. But the answer that as a consensus, I won't say it everybody, but as a consensus we have in Cuba, is that we need to be prepared to engage. And we need to be prepared by educating our people, by uplifting our values, showing what we can do, and be ready to be influenced by other ideological or cultural paradigms if that is the case. I think that in whatever case the truth should prevail, above all if it's real engagement, not engagement through digital networks. It's people to people, the real one. Now Marty from Seattle. The international community already rejects the economic blockade and US sanctions or coercive measures annually. It's been doing that since 1992. The US is totally isolated. In fact, one of the reasons claimed by the Obama administration for the change of policy was saying that the US policy isolated the United States, it didn't isolate Cuba. It ended up, and that is the case today. And that is because of the effort of many communities, including American communities, in calling for an international effort to repudiate the coercive measures against Cuba. It is an important effort. It is an effort that has results. But today, the fundamental effort has to be within the United States. Because the US government seems to be unmoved by the position of the international community, by the position of trade unions around the world, of NGOs around the world, of community organizations, of non-governmental organizations, of religious organizations, and of governments. It's immune. It doesn't care. So the major effort, without denying the other one, I would think should be within the United States. To influence your politicians. To make the government understand that it is not right to do that to the people of another country. That it's not decent to do that to the people, and that it's not fair. And to make them accountable morally, if not ideologically, but at least morally, is it right to punish the population of Cuba as a whole because they choose to be different? They just claim the right to be different than the United States. And I think that's where the effort should be, perhaps today, have more impact. And Lindy was how to take the conversation to other organizations around the world. I understand in terms of workers' organizations, what we can offer is our experience, which we truly believe is not replicable in other countries. I think that whatever experience you gain in Cuba, based on our neighborhood organizations, on our workers' organizations, on our women's organizations, on the way we relate in society, of our economic policies, of our educational policies, of our health policies, I think that are relevant references, but not applicable in another country. At some point, revolutionary organizations and movements, and we were at some point part of that, thought that what was good in one country, you just needed to apply it in another country. And we also went through that phase many years ago, when our revolution was younger, and the people in charge were younger too. And we also went through that phase. But truly, history has shown that it's not replicable. But engagement, sharing, learning from each other, the greater communication between organizations, that is what we need. Because that's what you build for your own circumstances and for your jurisdiction, what can be helpful, what can happen. That is the way I see it. I don't know if any of my comrades has a... Some of you are comrades from long ago. 3 of us shared in Angola as officers in the Southern Front of Angola. Different units, but at the same time.
And living in America, if I close my eyes when I'm listening to you, talking about what America has done to Cuba, I can hear similar things, or the same thing what America has done to black people as well as people of color. You know, they've employed the same strategies to demonize and destroy us as a community, just like the strategies they've employed to destroy Cuba as well. I believe that if we were to address those, then I think that our freedom is synonymous with Cuba's freedom if we deal with those issues. So my question to you is there one thing that I can do once I get off the airplane when I get back to Miami to start trying to deal with this situation, to address the blockade, to address how America oppresses Cuba as well as black and other BIPOC people to try to bring this to resolve. Thank you.
We could talk all morning just about our view about the function of the state. And to be truthful, that has been a debate in Cuba for the past, I would say, 10, 12 years. Very intense debate that led to amending our constitution in 2019. Because our concept of our society, the state had and continues to have a major role. To put it in simple words, as the broker to ensure social justice. It is the avenue through which you ensure social justice. Now, this could be different in different countries, including countries like ours that claim to be socialist. It's not the same role of the state. But in the past, we came to believe that the state was responsible for everything. From providing public education, public health, and national safety and security, to dry cleaning, and restaurants, and shoe repair shops. And for many years, we lived under those conditions. And we've come to the conclusion that the state doesn't have a direct role in managing and owning each and every business and commercial activity in the country. That the state does not have a role in repairing your shoes, or in a car wash, or in a dry cleaning, or in a barber shop, or in restaurants, all of them at least, or in all the business. And we have been withdrawing the role of the state in many areas as a way to ensure greater efficiency in our economy, of introducing new economic actors in our economy, private actors, including small and medium-sized enterprises and minimum-sized enterprises, some of which we call self-employed up to now, and strengthening the role of the state in the major sectors of the economy, those that belong to all of us, like mining, like major tourism, like the electrical grid, like major agricultural industry, steel, major industrial production. That continues to belong to the whole of the Cuban people, managed through the state. And the state has to strengthen its role in what we believe is the sole role of the state, which is healthcare. There's no private healthcare in Cuba. Education, sports in major areas. It doesn't mean that you can now have a personal trainer or something like that. The support of cultural and artistic activity, and of course defense and national security in our country. What we do believe is that the state, in whichever way any country should find, should be responsible to find an equilibrium between those that, because of luck, because of talent, because of personal wealth, or because of greater opportunity, are better off, and those that, for whatever reason, are less off, if that term exists, or in worse conditions in society in terms of the living conditions, the pay, the salary, the wages they receive, the way they can cope with their economic needs of them and their family. And that the role has to intervene to meet the gap in social inequality in society. I'm trying to simplify here what is a very complex discussion. That is the role that we see for the state. And we have a way in which we do it in the particular conditions of Cuba. The Chinese find another way, the Vietnamese another way, the Venezuelans another way. Is the way we see it in the particular conditions of Cuba. And we're still struggling with those definitions. It is not a finished homework. It is something that we continue to to improve because we think that we need to continue to test it every day. And that's why we speak on the Cuban Revolution in present terms. We don't speak of the revolution as of the past, as something that happened in 1959, the 1960s. When we speak of the revolution, we speak of our never-ending quest to achieve social justice and ensure development, prosperity with social justice. It's not a static concept. And that concept involves which is the role of the state always under question. And perhaps what we see today is different than 15 years ago, and what we find 15 years from now is different. But what we do not kid ourselves is to think that the state does not have a role in ensuring social justice in a society. That is the main concept for us. Mike from Oregon. We have an intensive, I would say, commercial relationship with China. It is perhaps our second economic partner today after Venezuela, which implies trade, implies credit, and is successful. I don't think that the economic might of China today and its economic priorities are sufficient to balance the damage produced or provoked by the economic blockade. And to say more, even in China, today we find banks, private banks in China, and sometimes state-owned banks in China that, because of fear of the damage they could suffer from the US, refuse to deal with Cuba, even in China. I'm not saying it's a majority. I'm not saying that it's making it impossible for us or preventing us to engage with China, but even in China we find that. We find it in every country around the world. But I'm saying even in China. And again, the might or the priorities of China today, which are important for Cuba, we cannot deny that, and have been very important for us for the past 30 years, I would say. It does not balance the damage provoked by the economic blockade. Mike, I believe, Mike from Guantanamo. Mark, it's my writing. I couldn't identify. We talked about it. It is a permanent issue with the United States. I will not say that it was among the basic priorities, because we understood that it was more difficult to overcome, and we're more concentrated in easing the economic blockade that has a major impact on Cuban life every day. And because there's since 1995, there's a monthly communication between the military command in the military base and the military command on what we call the liberated side, because it's the part of Cuban territory that is not occupied by a foreign power, which is what happens in Guantanamo, in the base which is in Guantanamo. But it is a topic, it is in the agenda of talks with the US. It was then, and it will have to be whenever we engage again. We're not engaging now in talks with the United States. Well, in terms of legal migration, the agreements, the migratory agreements between Cuba and the United States, which are several starting from 1984, include the commitment by the US government to ensure documents for at least 20,000 migrants from Cuba to the United States. In other words, 20,000 Cubans, the US has to ensure that 20,000 Cubans have the possibility of entering the US as migrants every year. Since 2018, the US has been missing this goal. And the figure is 2,000, 3,000, some years 4,000. Without any reasonable explanation. Yet, they allow people to enter through by illegal and irregular means. To give you an idea, in the fiscal year that ended in September 30th, I think the figure Ines was around 35,000, around Cubans, 38 Cubans entered the United States through the border of Mexico, irregularly, and were admitted in the United States. So the US refuses legal and orderly migration for Cubans, thereby forcing Cubans to having to go to a third country, sometimes as far as Uruguay, try to travel through the hemisphere, through Panama, falling into the hands of criminal organizations that enrich themselves by extortion to migrants, criminal organizations tied to illegal migration, to drug trafficking and so on, suffering huge kinds of problems in the border of Mexico with the United States, and then allow them in, and yet have been refusing to comply with their commitments since 2018. As a result of the Trump policy that, again, the Biden electoral campaign said that it would review and that it would revise and go back to the migratory agreements which were useful and beneficial for the United States. Yet nothing has done, and we continue today. In practical terms, what the Biden administration has done is to apply the Trump policy towards Cuba. They are the Trump sanctions, the Trump migratory actions, the Trump narrative and false narratives against Cuba. It's a continuation of the Trump government under the Biden administration. And Bobby, the question perhaps should be asked among you. But it is true. What the US does to Cuba is very similar to what it historically did to the Black and Afro-American communities in the United States. What we've studied in the history of the United States shows us that, and shows us that it's one of the big dilemmas of US society. It's similar to what the English did to the Irish for over 800 years. And it's the nature of capitalism and imperialism. It's what they do. In the case of the United States, you are having that exploitation done within your country to a specific community, as it was done historically to the Native Americans in the United States also. So what you can share is that what's being done to Cuba, you can say, is what historically was being done to us. We need to correct this globally. Not only for African Americans, not only for Native Americans, not only for Cubans. We need to correct this globally. But again, perhaps it's a question more between you than to be asked for us in Cuba. Thank you.